Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for the kind invite. It's a great pleasure to be in Paris. It's much warmer here than it was in Finland. Unfortunately, I don't speak any French, so that's a deficit. So apologies for not referring to those interesting talks that have been taking place in this conference earlier, but hopefully we have lively discussions and can have exchange of information and ideas otherwise. So my title is related to the inter and multidisciplinarity of game studies, and the talk outline relates to this kind of historical perspective, questions about sort of inherent sort of interdisciplinarity that is built into game studies. I make that kind of claim that there's sort of situatedness between disciplines built into our field, and then a bit highlights of that survey that was mentioned, that was carried out among games researchers, so that we can provide some kind of empirical data also that how disciplinary or interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary we are actually. And then I also provide in the end some examples from our own game research lab and the activities, the direction that our case has been taking while we have been carrying out game research or game studies in practice. So is this an emergent discipline in the making in the academia, multidisciplinary meeting ground, interdisciplinary field that is expanding, or are we actually coming back to our roots and the moment? So look into the history. What if you, for example, look into antiquity and look at the examples provided by Plato and Aristotle, you can already have this kind of duality of approaches. Plato was famous for favoring unified science, and Aristotle, on the other hand, has been heralded as the originator of several distinctive fields of inquiry: poetics, politics, metaphysics. So already in that sort of initial form of Western field of learning, you can have this kind of multiple different approaches. Romans were having this kind of discussions about the dangers of over-specialization already in those ages. So whenever you have field of learning, it seems that some people are sort of going deeper there, and maybe it becomes sort of risk for becoming isolated and not connected with other fields of learning or society surrounding this kind of field of inquiry or discipline. In educational ideas, if you are looking at the idea of university, you have this kind of universitas scientiarum, but also universitas magistrorum et scholarium, this kind of duality, community of disciplines of knowledge and community of teachers and students, where this kind of universality built into the university. The original idea is sort of overarching unity of all knowledge, but also this kind of community that is then created on distinctive fields. So when we are entering from this kind of original small scale groups of scholars into modern institutionalized universities, then you already have different disciplines. Not every teacher is capable of teaching every subject. You have fields of specialization, and universities are based on this kind of organization of knowledge into modern disciplines, fields of knowledge and fields of learning. So business as usual, it seems to be fine. So game studies, if it wants to become seriously regarded and member of the university community, it needs to organize itself as a discipline. So that seems to be clear. But when we go forward, Thomas Kuhn, his Structure of Scientific Revolutions in 1960s, was this kind of famous landmark for another turn towards this kind of revolutionary practice, and that was sort of going against normal science as this kind of steady progression of learning that is based on shared assumptions. So if you want to have really radical transformations in the field of learning, you need to have this kind of multidisciplinary contact, and then something that brings and builds bridges, this kind of interdisciplinary research activity. And in the third phase, you might have something like transdisciplinarity, this kind of new form of learning that is built and sort of fusions together several previously distinctive fields of learning. And this kind of requirement for bridge building and mixing of this kind of different fields, it has different backgrounds in the new needs of students, expanding sort of qualitative and quantitative range of research that has been going on during the 20th century and from since in expanding change. Also, changing society presents requirements for new fields all the time, and sort of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary collaboration is one way of creating new fields that are sort of addressing this, these needs. Also economic and administrative challenges in contemporary universities. So we in the universities, it is common now that we are presented with this requirement to produce innovations, something that is boundary breaking or paradigm shifting, new knowledge, and contributing to academic, but also national competitiveness. So it was already in one of our Bush's speeches in mid-1940s in the United States that scholarship grants should be based on how interdisciplinary, how much collaboration between fields those new research projects are promising. And in 1960s in Europe, at least, it started to become also a reality. And in these days, it's sort of that on the other hand, you can establish learning in certain kind of disciplinary formation, reach something, but particularly when more ambitious, large research grants are being discussed, then it is typical to also provide multi or interdisciplinary collaboration as one criteria for evaluating that. If we are looking then at game studies in its original forms, looking into the history, one could say that originally game studies has been multidisciplinary. So if you are looking at these kind of works, you have Stuart Cullin's Games of North American Indians, works that is rooted in the tradition of anthropology, in the field of history, Murray's History of Chess, for example. You have research that is related to games, not necessarily video games, von Neumann's mathematical game theory, then cultural and art studies field, Johann Huizinga, of course, very much also read and discussed in contemporary computer or video game studies. In computer sciences, chess programming, Alan Turing's, Claude Shannon's work has been influential. And then you have a distinctive sort of a different thread of origins for contemporary game studies in the field of educational sciences and learning and simulation, here featured by Richard Duke's 1974 book, Gaming the Future's Language. So in a sense, game studies in its original form has never been a single field, it has been multiple. Modern game studies, where many of us are sort of situating our work, started emerging in late 1990s particularly, and early 2000s it was the heyday. And it's was also situated in particular kind of transformations in the academic and sociocultural context for research and education. So there are multiple reasons. It had been discussed, for example, in the initial issue of the Games and Culture Journal from 2006, where why game studies now question was posed to multiple scholars, and everybody provided their own answers. So there were, for example, personal experiences among the younger generation of academics that were so clearly pointing towards this kind of new field that required interpretation, analysis, new theorization, also somewhat new touches in the scholarship. And the games of today, they can be, of course, studied from board game roots or classical rule systems that are similar to games of skill and chance of pre-digital era. But there's also this kind of qualitative differences, audiovisual simulations, expanded alternative realities, immersion in high-speed action, or then on the other hand, a different kind of puzzle solving that is provided by simulated three-dimensional environments and their new possibilities. So it was clearly technologically new era. It was also sort of new socio-cultural situation that required a new phase in the scholarship. But what was distinctive for discipline to emerging, that many important questions were formulated in a slightly different perspective. New focus on the ontology, what games are, what is the gameness, the heart of gameness in games, or what kind of particular kind of experiences or processes, those that are related to playing of games, what those are. And then epistemological questions, that if this is our subject of study, how it can be studied starting from that kind of ontological starting points. What is also valid knowledge about games or play? So one could make this claim that there is sort of inherent interdisciplinarity even in this contemporary game studies or modern game studies phase, that is rooted in the sort of deceptively simple appearance of digital games. Even if you take a game like Pac-Man or Tetris, you have activities that are taking place there in front of your eyes. You can record it into a video, and you can make extended analysis from different perspectives of it as a representation. Pac-Man could have a storyline that is related to compulsive consumption. See, it's a terrible game actually. Talks about this kind of need for endless consumerism or predatory capitalism or something like that. But then if you go deeper into that kind of direction, you are of course not doing justice to the dynamics of those, of Pac-Man moving around, and the sense of controlling that figure, and the dot eating dynamics and the optimization processes that go on in your mind while you are actually thinking about how those ghosts move in this particular level and so on. So there's a system of forces and counter-forces that is also revealed, and it's also only revealed when you are playing the game. So you have what I would call dual structure in digital games. They are interactive, they are digital media that requires certain tool set, and it points towards an analysis that has this kind of rich domain that is related to other audiovisual cultural forms. It is sort of rooted in semiotics and the study of science systems. But on the other hand, you have also the direction where you are analyzing dynamic systems and playful performances, how those systems are constructed to be capable of creating particular kind of behaviors, and how those behaviors are then actualized in this kind of environment. So what I tried to capture in my book on Introduction to Game Studies, Games in Culture, I talked about semiosis and ludosis as two distinctive ways of meaning making. That there's meaning making through science systems that you can interpret in the frameworks of other kinds of science, but then there's this ludosis. I don't know if I coined the term, but it's at least my attempt at capturing meaning making through playful interaction and playful engagement in action. That might be something that you can use also while analyzing, for example, jazz improvisation or dance performances, or something that is related to this kind of spontaneous or behavioral processes. And if you want to be an expert in studying of games, it sort of requires you to have both of these elements that are then coming together either in a single brain of a researcher that is capable of sort of addressing these kind of layers in digital games simultaneously or analyze them in different ways, or then you require interdisciplinary collaboration where you bring people together who come from different perspectives and are capable of bringing in sort of disciplinary background, methodological strengths, theorization that is related to these kind of different dimensions. Why would game studies want to be a discipline? It was sort of that, okay, we want to have a discipline of game studies. It was sort of obvious when we were establishing DICRA in 2002 or 2003. But then it became sort of a dubious question that are you trying to institutionalize or sort of stagnate game studies into this kind of dying dinosaur-like structure? Disciplines, they can be many things, but starting from this kind of perspective that in any sort of emerging young field is often the situation that basically I'm doing stuff nobody else is doing in our university. I'm trying to publish papers and then they get reviewed and rejected by people who don't understand anything about those works and concepts that I've been working on, and there's sort of no established criteria. It's sort of falling between the cracks and so on. So a discipline is a form of organizing scientific or scholarly knowledge and related practices. Can be rigid, it can be sort of stratifying academic practices, but it's also created for a reason. It facilitates communication, community formation, it provides institutional support, as well as continuity and progress in scholarship. For example, terminological clarity is something that it's very hard to establish if you don't have textbooks, if you don't have any sort of basic coursework or degree programs that provide sort of elementary understanding in that kind of field. So a shared language is something that needs to be sort of in the sociology of knowledge style of interpretation. It needs to be constructed and maintained all the time, otherwise it will vanish and people again speak different languages and they will stop understanding each other. And discipline bring together people focused on same or closely related phenomena. But if you really analyze what is going on in so-called established disciplines, my own background was in comparative literature and literary studies, all those disciplines, they are all the time in crisis. Crisis is healthy state. Everybody is in crisis in academia. They are questioning their identity and they are all the time disagreeing what is the proper subject of their study, why we are doing this and how we are doing. And disagreement is natural in critical inquiry of any kind. So even while you would love to have this kind of very clear and solid discipline of game studies, it will not happen. It will be chaotic, internally divided, and multiphonic. It will have multiple different voices. So that is the reality of disciplines, even while it has some kind of sort of consolidating power. But it provides some kind of support, so degree programs, also conferences, journals, associations, academic work positions. Those are realities that disciplines, they are capable of at least helping to emerge. So in this slide, I try to capture that what has happened over the years, and now we have DICRA, we have ISAGA, we have in multiple other associations possibilities of dedicating yourself into sort of communities or sub-communities of game scholars. We have journals, simulation and gaming is the old one, games and culture is more current, game studies and other publications. And on top of those classics, like Huizinga's Homo Ludens, there are new ones, there are rules of play, there are multiple different works. Some of them are dealing with sort of more general theoretical issues, some are more narrowly focused on studies of some type of game, sort of specialized volumes on different genres, and then there are works like playing video games here that is more empirically and social sciences oriented, so it has lots of quantitative research methodologies applied, and then you have qualitative studies of games and societies that gamers or communities that gamers are creating. And then you have also works that are more design oriented, so game studies as a discipline, if you take the publication volume and really analyze what is going on in those works, it is sort of opening up into different directions, but still there's this loose networking between all those publications that they are at least aware of each other to a certain degree, and they are building links and commenting and sort of building on top of each other, even through disagreement sometimes. So does it really matter to have a discipline in game studies? It's the academic affiliation is, it can be multiple things. It can connect people, but it can also separate people. It can create this kind of closed clubs, and they stop talking to each other. There are this kind of genuine differences in starting points if you consider how different scholars, scientists in academia, how they, for example, approach the role and status of games and play in culture and society. Some, for example, think that games are some kind of symptoms that should be analyzed, and their negative aspects and in the quality of life and the direction of the society should be explored. Some are seeing them in forms of self-expression or potential for artistic or other creativity. What kind of starting points should be adopted in research? What kind of knowledge about games and play is relevant and valuable knowledge? There are also great differences. And to what purposes should the knowledge about games primarily be used for? So some, for example, humanities-based scholars, they just try to pursue knowledge for knowledge's sake. It's valuable to understand and create concepts and theories and models that depict our experiences, our lived realities, and expand our horizons. And some try to achieve knowledge that has instrumental value that can be actually applied into various kinds of practical projects of various kinds. So there's plenty of room for genuine disagreement as well as on agreement in this field. So there are tensions whenever you are encountering something that is interdisciplinary, that is truly different parties are trying to reach out and collaborate and touch on each other. It doesn't automatically lead to agreement, this kind of happy together style of mentality. If you have been collaborating in interdisciplinary research project, you know that it can also lead into shouting contests of various kinds and some angry argumentations. And some people might be actually leaving their house to get out of your research project. So your dirty goals of research would not contaminate their pure idea of scholarship. So humanities scholars, they have their own hermeneutic, phenomenological traditions of thought, critical explorations into ontology of work of arts in the field of game studies. And then a social scientist enters the room and starts to talk about how we need empirical data that has been collected systematically and can be verified and provide some real science to this all kind of loose hand waving and talk, and humanities scholar starts shaking his or her head. Design researcher enters the room next and says that no, aim is at contributing to the innovation in games. You are just dabbling in this kind of ivory tower of scholarship. You should be creating games. That is the goal of game studies in design perspective. And then economical scientists, legal researcher, health researcher, educational scientists, and many others, they have also entered the field of game studies and sort of with their own knowledge aims and established practices. So Espen Aset in 2007, he wrote a paper, I have references at the end of this presentation, that even if you are having in same research group, like in Copenhagen and also in Tampere in our research group, social scientists and humanists in same team, you can have this kind of diverse publication interest and diverse interest in research that might actually be incompatible. That the object of game studies, for some it's sort of ideal form of games that you can approach purely from this kind of philosophical and conceptual level in order to sort of reach out towards this kind of more long-standing, more abstract level of knowledge about this field, not only sort of accidents of somebody thinking or somebody playing a game in a certain way. And the other style really tries to understand games as they are lived reality in the lives of certain empirical, real people who are playing games in certain ways. And this leads into differences in methodology and differences in the conceptual level and publication venues and so on. I think that it is true that one should sort of acknowledge these kind of differences, but there's also plenty of room for collaboration. I try to provide some examples here. So this survey that I briefly introduced here, it was designed by scholars with multiple backgrounds, particularly communication research, Jan van Looy and Thorsten Quandt from Belgium and Germany, and myself from Finland. My background is in the humanities and theirs in the communicational studies, and we tried to reach out to those communities that we knew about. So it was distributed, the 46 questions or statement groups to mailing lists of DICRA and the ICA, ECRIA, the communicational researchers, game studies groups. But for example, we did not distribute it to computer scientists. We were not personally involved, for example, in the Kai Play organization of computer science style of research, so it inevitably sort of tilts the results. We got plenty of responses, but this was rather long survey instrument and there were control questions, so out of the initial 808 responses, only 554 were considered as valid responses in the end. That is now used here in the analysis of data. So this is a sort of consolidated view of what is the disciplinary background of game scholars based on this survey. The actual reality was much more messy. I think that when I was collecting a list of degree programs, as those were mentioned in the please, if your degree program was not mentioned in the list, write it name there, and there were something like 70 or 80 different degrees or different disciplines mentioned in that slot. I needed to do lots of this kind of heuristic work of my own, try to think that, okay, this is philosophical degree, whether it belongs to mathematics or humanities, in order to sort of get to this high-level categorization. You can see that communication studies and humanities is dominating here the list, but there are plenty of other educational sciences, computer science degrees, psychology degrees, media studies, engineering, arts, social sciences, design, economics, business and management degrees. Some have their original degree in natural sciences, some in information studies, and even few people in game studies. But not many. It was also an overview in the design of the questionnaire that we did not include the category of having an original degree in the game studies. It was partly by design, partly by accident. It is related to the fact that there are so few of this, so what we wanted people to add those degrees by hand. And then we also asked that what is your current field that you are currently working on? And this is slightly different. So media studies is now leading the pack, and then you have communication studies and psychology and others. In order to sort of highlight what is going on here, I, with some help, draw this diagram, that what it shows is that you have people getting their degrees in various fields, and then they are starting their work in academia, they get employed in various projects, or they get another degree and they continue to PhD and postdoctoral work, and they are moving in terms of their orientation. And there are some fields marked with red, which are sort of losing people, like computer science. Here it is sort of leaking into design and leaking into engineering. Some people are going to do media studies. Then you have also arts and humanities and communication studies and engineering that are sort of those where people are heading to other challenges. And then you have other sort of attractive areas like media studies, design, and psychology also, and educational sciences that are getting influx of immigrants from these other sort of undergraduate or graduate degree programs. So one could interpret this in multiple ways. In positive terms, it says something about this kind of employability of people who are getting their basic degree in for example, computer studies or communicational studies and humanities. They are adaptive. They can get employed in other fields. They can continue their education in other areas. On the other hand, there are fields like social sciences that is sort of bubble floating there. Not much going on. Other social scientists here floating isolated in their own bubble. It seems to be that there's no need to sort of move from that field. Also, psychology is pretty much sort of there, that when you gain a degree there, you can then just continue working in that field and probably having their own publication venues and professional sort of paths. But all these other guys are talking a lot and messing around and building this kind of convoluted paths towards different kind of academic affiliations. So while 55% of respondents reported staying in their original degree field, 45%, so almost half of had changed into another one. So there were lots of transfers going on there. We also asked, are you a digital games researcher? So self-identification as representative of this field, and okay, this was distributed among special interest mailing lists, so 79%, almost 80% considered themselves to be either strongly or somewhat agreeing to be digital games researchers. Another thing, how does that correlate with their original degree? This is not statistically valid differences, but there are something interesting here. So, for example, if you are having your original degree in design, engineering, and humanities, you are slightly more hesitant to call yourself as a digital games researcher, game scholar. And then, for example, if your background is in the communication studies, media studies, computer sciences, so there's something going on there. But because of the small group and of these groups, and also this overwhelmingly positive dominance of yes or strongly yes voices, there's no statistically significant results here. But if you ask them, are you a gamer? So whether you are an active game player yourself, then you get statistically significant stuff. So 66% saw themselves as gamers. And also those who self-identified as gamers, they were also more likely to identify themselves as digital game researchers. So it might be that, for example, computer scientists, people, they were also active game players, more likely to than, for example, designers or engineers or some humanists even. So that was a stronger correlation here. So they identify also to be distinctly also game scholars. We were also interested in this interdisciplinary collaboration and activities that are build bridges between different fields and institutions. So majority of the respondents said that they had at least some research collaboration. Other researchers from own institution was most likely, also from other institution, then researchers from other country, international ones. Industry collaboration, 39%, so almost 40% said that they are collaborating with industry in different ways. Non-governmental organizations, national state government collaboration, international governments, European Union, US federal government style collaborations, or other. For example, some said that they consider collaboration with student unions or student organizations to be collaboration in their eyes. So what to sort of take as a lesson from this? In terms of background information, there's no one single or dominant, even among this rather selected group of game scholars, that would be playing a key role in organizing the academic identity of contemporary games researchers. We are a very diverse bunch. We are coming from multiple backgrounds. Also, this is highly multidisciplinary and dynamic field, as almost half of the survey respondents reported currently working on different fields from the original degree. And the unifying factor seems to be that they play games, or at least they are interested in the field so much that they, most of them, they identify themselves to be digital game researchers. But it's not an exclusive identity. It's capable of sort of coexisting and combining with other academic affiliations. So you can be a psychologist and a games researcher, or you can practice game studies and also do sociology or communication studies, or published in humanities journals. So it is something that can sort of fit in and be combined in flexible manner with other identities. So it's also worth mentioning that while majority are sort of game players, over a third of respondents said that they are not. So there's also a sizable portion of games researchers who are not active game players, and that's probably also healthy. This is not sort of close club of gamer scholars, but it's also having people who are sort of approaching that from a different perspective and different experiences. Then a couple of examples from our own work. When we started in late 90s, we were actually originally doing art and culture studies. Then we got more skilled in acquiring funding, and our style of doing research was also growing increasingly diverse and multidisciplinary. So this early 2000s, for example, this power and control of games research was collaboration methodologically between humanities game scholar with a psychologist, sort of social science perspectives that they were fitted together. So we were, on the other hand, we were top-down, trying to understand theoretically what kind of elements there might be that could be used as concepts and this kind of overarching models that could be used to understand gameplay, playing, and experiences of games. And then we were also gathering empirical data, observational data, lots of interviews, and using that as this kind of bottom-up approach, and then sort of triangulation, fitting together of different perspectives. So this was the theoretical model that we then published originally in 2005. It has been slightly modified and republished afterwards. But this was a model that was very strongly focused on immersive style of play. So it was this kind of action-intensive computer games that are rather complex, and also probably games that we ourselves were interested as game players. I was active role-playing gamer, and other members of our team, they had their own favorites in this kind of complex and immersive games. But we also validated our instrument. So if you are interested in the SCI questionnaire, I have the original Finnish questionnaire statements also in English translation. So if you mail me, I can share you that, because it produces this kind of interesting immersion profiles. So you through respondents that you can, for example, implement as an online survey, you get people reporting how strongly immersed they were in sensory terms, challenge-based sort of dynamic gameplay terms, or in terms of fantasy and imagination. And this could then be used to sort of categorize games so that action adventures and role-playing adventure action games, they are very strong in all three areas. And then you have games like The Sims that is weaker because it's not as strongly immersive. But what we realized was that this was actually for those people who were responding to our second stage of our research, this was the best game. This was the optimal game play experience, and it was not strongly immersive. They were preferring different kind of experiences that were not blocking them out from all the other things, but they were actually more open towards this kind of more casual style of play. So we needed another kind of models, so we were turning towards understanding casual games and casual gamers, this kind of larger demographics. And we were also starting to realize that different kind of social contexts were strongly modifying how games are being used and what kind of significance it has. So we were also expanding beyond this kind of gamer demographics to different kind of places where people are playing games, also like slot machine games and lottery games, and filling in crossword puzzles, and people who are just casually flipping Angry Birds in their mobile phone or something like that. So we were then employing stuff that we were stealing from multiple different fields. One model was this cultural studies, Johnson's circle of cultural production. So this is basically this kind of circulation of cultural materials between production and consumption, different cultural forms, and their concretization is something that is discussed there. And we use that kind of elements to build other models like expanded game experience model. This is linked to one of those models. I have here reproduced my own model from 2007 paper where I try to capture this kind of, the idea is this is a layered illustration that I'm a crappy illustrator, but I try to put multiple layers on top of each other so that you have this kind of individual experience there, but you have also other like immediate personal contexts. Then you have social context, but also the production of games has its own context that, for example, the examples of previous games in the same genre, they provide models for those who are developing games and also experiences for game players so that they compare their experience of this particular game against their earlier game experiences. And also there's the wider context of social norms and values that is informing the entire experience, whether I am allowed to experience positive emotions here or is this something shameful and so on. So this has had various implications for the direction that our research has taken. So I was talking about this kind of expanding challenges, and this is what is taking place now in our research lab. We are now studying basically everything and everyone. We are studying how people play games in everyday environments. We are doing design-oriented experimentations on pervasive games. We are looking at games that have nothing to do with digital elements. So we are no DICRA pure digital game researchers. We are just games researchers. We are looking at live action role play. We are looking at board games, card games of various kinds, as well as like sports, physical games. It has also entered into the domain, as well as gambling and lottery and so on. So there have been lots of stuff going on there. And in other area, it is not only games, but it is play and playfulness and also gamification that has expanded the range of different phenomena that we are now studying. So starting from game studies, we have started to study play and play elements in culture in much wider sense. And it seems to be that it's, on the other hand, it's beneficial. There's much need for game scholars in different kind of societal areas, in different kind of health gaming, improvement of different kind of services through the analysis and design guidelines taken from games. But it's also leading into this kind of increasing diversification that creates its own sort of questions about the viability of game studies as a disciplinary field. So discussion is going on. We had the critical evaluation of game studies seminar in 2014, and then in DICRA 2015 we had this From Game Studies to Play in Society panel. Among those voices, Espen Aarseth, notable precursor in this field, he says that game studies is not a field and its establishment as a discipline should not be desired. But Simon from Canada, he said that game studies should remain true to the unserious character of games and play. So if you are making it too serious academic project, you are sort of spoiling the thing that we started to hunt for. So keep it as an anti-discipline, please. Then Sebastian Deterding, he favors design research as this kind of overarching project, but he also pointed out in his paper that is still to be published in special issue that is coming from this seminar, that there are so few career opportunities in academia still in game studies. So there are very little professors of game studies or assistant professors of game studies that you need to have this kind of alternative career path. So games research, special interest groups in computer sciences, communication studies, in various other fields, they are much more attractive venues, and they are sort of stealing much of the steam out of the sort of core area of game studies currently, that people are sort of realizing that realistically, in order to get employed, I need to publish in these specialized journals on my native discipline rather than in these interdisciplinary, not so highly ranked journals and smaller conferences. But still I see steady interest also in this kind of interdisciplinary venues and collaboration, and I think that DICRA 2015 was probably the best DICRA ever. It was really great conference, and there was lots of really interesting research coming out of that too. Joost Rijsens, professor from the Netherlands, he talked about strategic essentialism of gender studies, and it could be applied to game studies as well, that even while everybody that is seriously working in this field realizes that there's no sort of closed essential character for game studies, it makes strategic sense to say that it is one discipline among others, because otherwise you are not going to get anywhere in terms of academic sort of institutionalization, in terms of any sort of future in academic work prospects, etc., etc. So you need to also consider that what is sort of the tactically sound way of maintaining some kind of core in the field. And it's also, like I said in the beginning, that disciplines are good for this kind of basic theory creation. It's good for teaching. It's good for this kind of consolidation of certain kind of key elements, as well as you need then this kind of impulses that are not only centripetal but are also centrifugal. They are bringing in new stuff, and then you take it in and you have this kind of breathing movement of consolidation, expansion, and then going to the core questions again and again. So that was my introduction, my talk today. Thank you.
So we will take some questions, not a lot. So you have to be first if you want.
Thank you very much for this talk. I'm not sure, but I think I feel the form. I'm not sure. Did you have the? Maybe you've showed us, but here it's very small because of the PowerPoint. What the distribution between countries? I mean, how many countries were involved? Did you have that in mind, or?
There's so long time since I carried out the analysis, so I don't remember the exact number. But
yeah.
It must have been over a dozen or even more. So
yeah.
It was very international, the range.
Okay. Yeah, because I was thinking, but maybe it's gonna. We're gonna talk about that later. The language of the cultural. Relation, maybe did you see some relation between countries and how they feel belonging to game studies or not?
I think that we didn't carry out the analysis in that regard. It would be interesting. There has been multiple publications coming out of that, so it might be even something to consider. But it's true that there are different sort of institutional frameworks in different countries, and every time we are discussing in international context, it becomes really obvious that people some have very strict limits on how they can sort of apply games in their own academic career, and in some cases there's much more flexibility, but we have not carried out that dimension of the survey analysis.
Okay, thanks.
Have you tried age and gender? Because you asked the question of gamers, and I have the feeling that it could be related to age. And
it might be. No, I don't remember that we tried that analysis. So, that first paper that we published, it was very quickly run on this kind of very initial sort of a level of analysis for that.
Thank you very much. You said at the end of your presentation that there are points of view regarding disciplinarity or not of digital game-based study, but what is your point of view regarding that, and why?
Disciplinarity, you mean? Whether game studies should be a discipline or not? Well, I personally think that it's important to have these two elements, that we have smaller sort of degree programs and some people who have the mandate to really focus on games as games, sort of basic ludological project. I think it would be really shame to lose that part of academia, since it has been really, it has stimulated so much things that have been now taking new directions in other fields that are not called as game studies, but for example in computer sciences there's now the Kai Play conference, and in other fields, other activities. So I think that it is like that you need dedicated games degrees and game scholars to also provide some kind of service for interdisciplinary collaboration. In this one article that was published in the Video Game Theory Reader 2, I'm saying that in order to have multidisciplinarity in game studies, you need to have game studies, so that it can be part of that multi. There needs to be some sort of core identity, so that you can have any sort of dialectic that also questions and expands and forces that core to sort of change itself. So in that sense, it's important to have that. But it's also that I think that every discipline needs to be a game discipline today, or study of play. And that relates to the idea that now that we understand how fundamental play and playfulness is for our emotion, cognition, for our social interactions on multiple dimensions of our existence, it would be really stupid not to take that into consideration when you are doing organizational studies, when you are trying to understand how to do co-design of educational environments and so on. So every discipline in some sense needs to be a game discipline, but you also need some area that is sort of focusing on them as they are, as a form of culture and entertainment, something that is really source of passion for some people, and also for just casual, occasional pleasure for others.
Yeah, just thank you for this landscape, very interesting. A question on the transfer between discipline. Have you the data for a comparison between the discipline in general and the discipline involved in game studies? Because the phenomenon of transfer could be also a phenomenon of discipline and not especially of game study field. For instance, art. I've read many papers that comment that art is a discipline that is transferring a lot. And so, of course, it's appear here, but maybe in many other fields, there is a phenomenon of transfer. And so my question was, I think a comparison with general data could be very interesting.
Yeah, I agree. It would be really helpful to do that, but I didn't have time to look into that aspect. So I agree that it's probably not atypical, but it's rather something that is rather common in contemporary academia. It's also related to how academic work market is designed. While I was thinking about that, I read a couple of papers that were basically pointing out that increasingly this kind of opportunistic character of academics is based on this kind of employability ideal, that how I make myself attractive to different fields, and it's risky to be very narrow specialist in something. Then you really need to be good in that one thing, so that you can really publish in systematically, very productively in narrowly focused, high specialization journals and so on. But it makes for most people much more sense to be generalists, where you have different skill sets and you can do multiple different kind of jobs.
Yeah, and behind this, I think, connected to what Vincent said, that the category of discipline have to be discussed more deeply, because I think discipline in the northern country or in the Latin country is absolutely a different things, institutionally, but maybe also epistemologically. For example, the field studies have a very small legitimacy in the south, and in France, for example, it's not the same in northern countries. So,
yeah, it would be interesting. Maybe we can tackle that also in the panel, that roundtable that is starting, because I think that Nordic universities are probably pretty liberal in the style that we have all sorts of. Like in our university, we have North American studies, so you can. Well, basically do everything that is related to North America there. That's accepted discipline in this kind of
it's the same. If the disciplines exist, but the question is behind its legitimacy in the university field.
Thank you. So it seems to me that in your lab, multidisciplinarity seems to work, or at least partially. So how do you mentioned that problem, maybe you have suggestions of solutions, but in my university we have a very traditional computer science department, but I'm not in computer science. The humanities are much more flexible in design as well. So if I approach one of my computer science colleagues with a project, what he tells me is that, oh yeah, that's great, but if I publish at DIGRA or at Foundations of Digital Games, that line is not even legible to my colleagues and I won't get tenure. So what happens? What do you do there?
That's a really good but also a difficult question, because the solution really depends on your individual sort of environment. Basically, I always advise that game scholars, aspiring ones, please be an academic game player. Think carefully about the game that you are sort of invested in, and try to think both with your brain and your heart, that where the passion is, what you really want to contribute in your life, and then try to find different paths and think strategically how you can reach that goal in your life. And for example, in our case, it was necessary to establish this kind of experimental laboratory that was not part of any established department. And basically we, rather than having this kind of highly qualified academics who were already very advanced and very focused in their individual careers, we were hiring gifted students that were talented, but also open and flexible to collaboration across fields. And in our case, the monetary support was coming not from this kind of high prestige academic grants, but we were successful in getting innovation grants, these kind of smaller things that were supposedly should be sort of only applied science or practice oriented, but we actually smuggled theoretical research questions, not telling the grant organization, of course, that we were building theory, while we were also promising that we are producing this interesting concept or prototype of a novel future service of this or that. but we were using that as a platform of experimentation, getting lots of data, and then our people were sort of inventing their own identity as they were going along. And that has basically what has been taking place now. It's probably easier now to be a game scholar than it was in 2001 or 2002, because we at least have some venues that have already been ranked, for example, in our Finnish publishing ranking system, DICRA and some other venues. They are already there, so you get your sort of tenure recognition through publishing in those, but it must be very different in different countries. Should we go to the round table?
We're going to discuss about that.
What?
The tradition in the country, so it's a good break.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.